We are at risk of losing the information war. The widespread normalization of disinformation as a political tool is accelerating distrust in democratic institutions and processes. But online disinformation has offline consequences, as we saw during the coronavirus pandemic and on January the 6th in Washington. Malicious actors such as Russia and China have also proved adept at weaponizing information for their foreign policy objectives. Governments have held off from intervening strongly in the online media sphere for fear of wrecking classical, enlightened liberalism. But at what cost? What are the risks that online disinformation will contribute to the dismantling of democracy? The Silicon Curtain podcast has been created to explore issues around propaganda narratives and techniques and the threat they pose to open societies. If you enjoy the material we create, then please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos in YouTube. In fact, this channel was created in order to give a voice to people like my next guest. Nina Jankowicz is an author, advocate for targets of online abuse, and internationally recognized expert on disinformation and democratization. Her debut book, How to Lose the Information War, Bloomsbury 2020, was named as a New Statesman Book of the Year. Her second book came out last year and is called How to Be a Woman Online. Nina is currently the Vice President US at the Center for Information Resilience. She has advised governments, international organizations, and tech companies. She has also testified before the United States Congress, UK Parliament, and European Parliament. Jankowicz has extensive media experience and has been published in many major American newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. She is a regular guest on major radio and television programs such as PBS NewsHour, CNN's Fareed Zakaria, GPS, and Amanpour, and the BBC World Service as well. She's fluent in Russian and speaks proficient Ukrainian and Polish. So Nina, welcome to the channel. It's absolutely delighted to have you here with us. And
thanks for having me, Jonathan.
Well, thank you so much. And I know you've got 15 million things on the go. First of all, I'd love to learn a bit more about the Center for Information Resilience, its history, its work, who you do the work for, where does the product that you produce go to, and the impact of it as well.
Sure. So the Center for Information Resilience was founded in 2020 by two former UK civil servants. It's based in London. And we're a nonprofit social enterprise that's focused on combating disinformation, documenting human rights abuses, and countering online harms against women and minorities. And we do all of that work through open source investigations and research. And some of our work is funded by governments. Some of it's funded by not-for-profits. We also accept donations, small donations. But I would say the main beneficiary of our products is frankly the public. We produce all of the reporting that we do publicly. We show our work. So when we're doing investigations into, attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, or burnings of villages in Myanmar, or extrajudicial killings in Afghanistan, we show our work with all of that. So anybody can look on our website and see how we got to the conclusions we got to. They can track the evidence back themselves, and they can see that that is the God's honest truth there. And we think that that's really important in this age of, alternative facts, in showing just based on evidence that is available on social media that anybody can look at and teach themselves how to kind of extrapolate from that's what's going on. And so it's been really powerful, I think, in particular in regards to the three countries I mentioned, but obviously most important to me as somebody who has spent a lot of time studying Russia and lived in Ukraine is the work that we do with regard to Ukraine and the terrible, horrific violence that has been going on at the hands of the Russian army as it has invaded and then really affected the civilian population of Ukraine for almost a year now.
So very evidence-led, very transparent, very open. Are you also open about the methodologies that you use to get from the raw data through to the conclusions?
Yeah, absolutely. On all of our reports, you can kind of just see exactly how we did our work. So we've got, let me just talk about our Eyes on Russia project, which tracks Russian influence and Russian aggression in Ukraine. That we source through a bunch of volunteer open source organizations who find online all sorts of data coming from platforms like TikTok and Twitter and Telegram and Facebook, all of these open source videos that civilians shoot from their mobile phones. We then geolocate and triple verify them. So we know where they happened and when they happened. And then we're able to kind of show patterns from that. You know, here's the pattern of attacks on civilian infrastructure. Here's the pattern of troop movements ahead of the invasion. That was something that we were tracking in depth. So yeah, anybody can look at the methodology. Anybody can kind of pull back the hood on our inner workings. And I think that makes it really powerful and really compelling.
And a lot of Russian propaganda in particular, but I guess this could be applied to much disinformation that's being used as a political tool. It targets civilians, doesn't it? And we saw that very clearly in things like the sham referenda. We see this in the messages that are being put out around the deportations. And of course, in the early days of the war in Bucha, trying to deny the fact that these genocidal acts, these war crimes are taking place, a whole barrage of misinformation and stories to kind of confuse and muddy the waters.
Absolutely. And one thing that we saw when we got the Eyes on Russia project started around this time last year was the UK and US governments declassifying intelligence, saying, oh, we might see false flag attacks coming from Russia. I got a lot of inbounds from journalists and other folks at that point saying, do you really think Russia would do this? And my answer was, yes, they've done it before. And I think we're going to see it based on what we're seeing coming in from social media. We're going to see it again. And lo and behold, just days later, we saw a false flag attack where Russia had claimed there was a car bombing in a Russian-held territory in the Donbass. And what actually happened was Russia blew up a car on its own and had placed cadavers in that car to make it look like there had been civilian casualties. And what we were able to see, along with many other open source investigators, was that when you zoomed in on the footage, the fairly gruesome footage or stills from that video, you saw that these were in fact cadavers and had kind of the markings on their skull of having undergone a postmortem. So we did see those false flag attacks. We were able to kind of support the intelligence conclusions that had come from a variety of different governments that had been declassified. And we've been continuing that kind of, those investigations that shed, stark light on the lies that Russia has continued to spread over the past year.
And is there a big difference between sort of the mixture of OSINT or open source intelligence and declassified military intelligence that you might be using or have access to, and the kind of pure open source type operations like Bellingcat and so on? And also, there are, of course, Ukrainian, open source organizations, but they will also go further in terms of hacking databases and, in our view, perhaps illegally acquiring information, obviously for, one could say, noble causes. Are these the main three sort of types in the ecosystem, or is it a much more complex, diverse ecosystem?
Yeah, I would say that is the main overarching picture. And I should add that we don't have any special access to military intelligence. We were just following the reporting coming out of Number 10, coming out of the White House. Bellingcat is one of the organizations in our consortium that is contributing to our Eyes on Russia map, where you can go in and see any number of incidents that we've tracked and verified. So we operate very much in a similar vein to Bellingcat. And we don't deal with the illegal data side of things that some of the Ukrainians and others that you've mentioned do deal with. That we leave that to those folks and try to deal with what is out in the open and what we can verify ourselves in that regard. The other thing I would add is that there's a whole network of influence operations that kind of work in tandem with the things that we're seeing on the ground, that these kinetic activities that Russia might be, staging or otherwise. And that's, the use of inauthentic amplification or inauthentic activity on social media platforms. And we do some of that research as well, looking at coordinated networked attacks on individuals, on, entities online. And we kind of compare those up with what we're seeing on the ground. I would say, in Ukraine in 2022, we're seeing, and 2023 now, we're seeing a lot less of the same sort of brute force, coordinated and authentic amplification and activity that we saw 2014, 2015, 2016, even 2017. And that's in part because the platforms have gotten really good at cracking down on trolls and bots. But also it seems to me that the Russian strategy has shifted a little bit. It's more about kind of a top-down trickle down, if you will, narrative laundering from Putin and his kind of top generals and officials that then gets amplified by the Russian propaganda machine, RT Sputnik, and fellow travelers in the West who share Russian viewpoints. And there's really no point to that inauthentic brute force amplification when the platforms are savvy and, frankly, consumers of information are savvier as well. So we've seen a bit of a shift in that regard, in my opinion.
And I guess I mean this is my assumption here. It'd be interesting to know if it's the case. Those countries that are contributing most militarily to the effort against Russia are likely to also be those societies that are more impervious to these kind of Russian disinformation. To an extent, maybe they've realized that these aren't the places they should be focusing on, and they've moved their attention to prevent other countries actually joining the Western alliance or to joining the sanctions regime. So that would be the global South, China, Iran, etc. And even those countries in Europe which are having a bit of a wobble, Serbia, Hungary, even to an extent, sort of, well, maybe Italy to a lesser extent. But you know what I mean? Those countries which are unlikely to be significant players in the allied ranks against Russia.
Yeah, I think we're certainly seeing a little bit of that, and the kind of broadly forecast Ukraine fatigue that so many people thought we were going to be meeting with just months into the war really hasn't come to fruition in a way that that many had thought. So we're almost a year in, and there's still broad-based approval throughout the EU, throughout Britain, throughout the United States of support of Ukraine. And I have a couple of hypotheses about why that might be. I think, unfortunately, I mean, I say this unfortunately because it sheds kind of an unfortunate light on some of our populations. I think that's because of affinity and proximity. So proximity in Europe, a lot of Europeans understand that Ukraine is the bulwark to, a hot war coming to their back door. Affinity because these are, white Christian people who are working for a system that is very similar to ours. I think a lot of Europeans, Americans, and Westerners writ large identify with those folks a lot more than they might identify with, refugees coming from Afghanistan or Syria or otherwise. And then there is the refugee problem, which brings me to where I think Putin does have a bit of a touch point, a vulnerability that he can exploit there. And we do see some refugee resentment, particularly in countries that are taking a large share of refugees. We see that, for a little bit in Germany. We certainly see that in some other European countries. And I think that is something, a vulnerability in the EU that Putin can definitely exploit. But as you say, we're seeing a lot of strength across the transatlantic alliance in that regard. Putin is definitely looking toward the global South, in particular, some African countries, in order to bolster support for his narratives there. I think those are particularly countries that are, a little bit easier to manipulate because of their dependence on grain, for instance, because of an easily kind of manipulated narrative coming from Russia, which has a historic tie to some countries in Africa in the kind of post-colonial environment, has traditionally stood up in the anti-colonial movement. And so I think Western governments have a pretty important story to tell there about why what Russia is doing in Ukraine is actually the exact sort of thing that many of those populations fought against not so long ago.
And the next question, I think, is going to be quite difficult to frame, but I want to put it in sort of marketing terms. And you have something like a marketing funnel where, you attract someone with a nice, juicy little piece of content or some particular idea, often with some sort of basis in fact. And if you've got them on that, you then try them, take them down to something else and something else and something else, and you take them through a journey, which is often quite far from where they started. Mm-hmm. To an extent, it seems that Russian propaganda works in a similar way, or even most weaponized conspiracy theories. They will start with some sort of basis in fact, some kind of real issue or real contention in people's lives. but then it's a slippery slope from there to something else.
Mm-hmm.
So it might be, could be, you start by having a concern about, politicians in Washington, it could be, or something like that, or where are my taxes going? And then you can get sucked into, say, anti-coronavirus, where you're starting to move a little bit away from science. Nonetheless, it's still a debatable area. And isn't it extraordinary that so many of those conspiracy theories seem to have a kind of breadcrumb trail down towards others, which, eventually, when you get down to it, are so far away from reality and are pure propaganda. And yet people have been led on a journey down to them. I mean, so that's quite a crude kind of example, but could you tell me sort of how that works and how your organization traces that sort of provenance of these kind of weaponized information?
Yeah, so this is something that I think we're seeing more and more, particularly over the last couple of years. You mentioned COVID disinformation, and there's been a lot of this in kind of the health and like yoga community. I used to teach yoga, so I've got a lot of folks in my orbit who are kind of into that a little bit alternative health, like homeopathic sort of thing. And those communities in particular were sucked into the COVID-19 conspiracies. There's just kind of 1 degree of separation between that stuff and then going down a crazy COVID rabbit hole. And again, people have the right to do their own research. They have the right to, look into vaccines, look into remedies, look into what the government is saying and be skeptical. And I think that they should, frankly, given our government's track records on some of these issues. But as you say, there's a vulnerability there that can be exploited by bad actors, either for power or for profit. And so what we've seen Russia do is look at those particular vulnerabilities in society, be they race or economic class or hot button issues like abortion or gun rights, or in Ukraine, historical memory. We've heard a lot about, the neo-Nazi narrative that Russia is saving Ukraine from Nazis. This is actually fairly, until recently, was a really resonant narrative for parts of Ukraine and certainly a lot of parts of Europe as well, because no one wants a second, or I guess we would call it in this case, I was going to say a second Third Reich, but it would be a Fourth Reich, right? No one wants to see that. No one wants to see those atrocities repeated. There is a really stark and potent historical memory among populations, particularly in Ukraine and Poland and Central and Eastern Europe. And so that narrative was very calculated, coming from Putin, and again, tried to take people down that rabbit hole. And the thing I think is important to underline as well is that Russia's really good at establishing that modicum of trust. So there's that grain of truth that you mentioned to each little bit of disinformation. I think there's a misunderstanding in general that disinformation is about cut and dry fake news. It's not. It's about misleading people. It's about really grounding a narrative in people's real grievances and then bringing them further along. So once you've established that basic trust from step 1, you can kind of up the ante a little bit. You can ask them to do things like sign petitions or show up in person to rallies or share your content on social media, write to their congresspeople, write to their representatives. That sort of involvement, not just armchair activism, but really getting involved IRL in real life, as some people say, is very real and something that Russia has a track record of doing. How we do this really differs from investigation to investigation, and it differs on the type of material that we're looking at. So sometimes in the past, what I've done is I can find, kind of the linchpin to my story. It's one person who's been affected by this. And from there, I can unravel their activities, who got in touch with whom, and bring it back to some piece of information that's either been attributed by investigators who are looking at kind of the back end data, things like IP addresses or other kind of breadcrumbs online, or other data that we have either that's been declassified by governments or brought out into the open by some of those other groups that we had talked about who might have access to, hacked materials and things like that. And so then we can make the linkages and tell the story. And I think that's really important. It's not just about debunking. It's not just about saying to people, this isn't true. I've always tried to show the human impact of disinformation, whether we're talking about two examples in my work have been a liberal organization, a progressive organization that organized a flash mob in front of the White House in 2017, and they had been supported by Russia. I wanted to show how, that got came to fruition without their knowledge. Or a gym owner in my hometown in New Jersey, who wanted to reopen his gym during COVID, wasn't really into the political side of things, and his cause became a cause celeb for QAnon conspiracy theorists and COVID deniers and all sorts of other people because of the way Facebook's algorithms recommended them to all those kind of fellow travelers there. So it really does differ from investigation to investigation, but I would say, again, telling that story, showing the impact on people's lives, and showing really how it's a human problem is something that's personally important to me, and I think important to CIR as well.
Well, that was definitely one of the questions I was going to come to. Let's jump in straight with that one. And social media technology has played a huge pivotal role in the weaponization of information. I mean, no good obviously pretending that this was happening anywhere in society. It's gone hand in hand with technology. I mean, people forget. Those who've read Bulgakov, those who've read about Orson Welles and the radio broadcast in the 1930s, or even seen how effective German propaganda was in the Second World War, tend to forget that also went hand in hand with the development of new technology and medium, which is radio. And I think, people, it takes sometimes decades or even generations or a generation for people to develop the immunity, the defense mechanism to consume information critically through a new technological medium. So how on earth, not just you, how on earth do governments hold social media to account when the actual algorithms are designed to provoke, I would say, conflict? They're designed to, out of, a whole range of topics, from sort of, boring to truthful, untruthful. Let's actually park truth or untruth. They're designed to promote content that's really compelling, and often that is going to be stuff that's quite divisive, that provokes a debate, etc. And they've moved the pivotal point in society and discussion to a much more extreme place, a much more divided place than it was before.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to say that the most engaging content on social media is the most enraging content. And whether that is about, we've seen a lot of investigations into diet culture and how that affects young people, similar things with mental health problems in young people, to, the political issues that we see a lot of disinformation spreading about. All of that is incentivized on these platforms, because the more that we are angry or emotional, the more we're going to keep scrolling, keep replying, keep liking, keep sharing. And I think that's really problematic. Now, we've run into some problems with social media regulation around the world, because some governments have tried to play what I call the whack-a-troll approach to countering disinformation. They're very focused on moving particular pieces of content rather than changing the infrastructure that promotes that content. So Germany, for instance, has its NetzDG law, which requires social media platforms to remove certain content within a certain period of time or risk large fines. It's manifestly illegal content that they're required to remove, but Germany has pretty high standards for what is manifestly illegal, right? They have a very different relationship to freedom of expression than Americans do. That would never fly here. But instead, what we've done is kind of twiddle our thumbs and say, well, we don't want to infringe on freedom of expression, but we can't find a happy medium to figure out how we conduct oversight over the platforms. And instead, what we've had is kind of a reactive situation where some big scandal comes out either through a whistleblower or a journalistic investigation, sometimes a mixture of the two, and then Congress is whipped into a frenzy, and they haul Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or whomever else before them, and try to get to the bottom of what's going on. And of course, the tech executives are able to kind of squirm their way out and not give really detailed answers. And to be frank, the congressmen are not the best equipped to really do those investigations, because most of them don't have social media profiles anyway. They don't understand how this stuff works.
It's not a left-right thing, is it? I mean, there were a whole range of GOP and Democratic senators, and I saw those, Facebook, inquiry, and the questions were so lame and ill-informed.
Absolutely.
Embarrassing.
So at this point, even though it isn't a left-right thing, we have kind of been mired in polarization about this issue. The GOP says that it's something about protecting freedom of speech, and we can't regulate because of that. And the Democrats say, well, we have to regulate because the way the algorithms work, it's promoting a lot of speech and then silencing other people, right? And we haven't seen, to get to the bottom of this, what we need is oversight to understand how those algorithms are working, who they're recommending, why they're recommending them, and what the platforms are doing to tip the scales, if they're doing anything at all. Right now, what we have is not exactly hearsay, but only bits and pieces of a very curated narrative that is mostly curated by the social media platforms themselves. So when I talk about regulation, I say we need oversight first to be able to start this conversation about regulation, and then talk about what the best ways are for government to intervene and protect populations, not only against disinformation, but harmful information. We've had a lot of information out there that radicalizes people to offline violence, that changes people's decision-making in terms of healthcare, and other, decisions that affect public safety and public health. And I think that's clearly something that the government needs to get involved in. If we had airliners crashing or certain cars crashing over and over and over, we'd have oversight into those makers of planes and cars. For some reason, we haven't had a similar oversight mechanism introduced, at least in the United States, with regard to social media.
And it's interesting, isn't it? It's not necessarily even just confined to social media. There's also the sort of cable networks which have extremely loose regulation. And something that always sort of shocked me is, I mean, agree, you don't want to start regulating debate, even if it's people you don't agree with, and it's vociferous, unpleasant debate. Yeah, you got to let that stuff happen. But when it turns to extreme misogyny, threats, stuff which, if you'd uttered it on the street, would 100% get you arrested because it's absolutely against the law, there seems to be a hesitancy at prosecuting existing laws that would work in the offline sphere, in the online sphere.
Yeah, it's a very complicated environment, one that I myself am quite familiar with. Unfortunately, I've been on the receiving end of many of those threats and online abuse campaigns. And there is not only a misunderstanding of the impact that online abuse and harassment can have on a person, but there really is a lack of legal infrastructure writ large to deal with that, especially in the United States where we have a federal system. So if you like, you can get a restraining order against somebody who's been harassing you online, but if they live in a different state, there's no way to enforce it, or very little way to enforce it unless they show up at your house or show up in person at a place that you are. So that makes things more complicated, of course. And then, generally the onus is on the target of the abuse to report all of this stuff, to protect themselves. And it is exhausting to deal with this stuff when you've got thousands or even tens of thousands of threats and abuse coming to you on a daily basis, even if it's just for a short period of time, wading through all of that, documenting it, deciding what is worth pursuing, what is worth, leaving aside, reporting it to the social media platforms, and then deciding whether or not you're going to pursue, law enforcement action. It is essentially a second or third full-time job for most people, and you cannot go through it alone. So one of the things that I've been doing, and this is part of our work at CIR as well, is trying to document the harms that we see online in spaces like Myanmar, Afghanistan, and we're going to be broadening that work out soon as well. People don't understand the connection between online and offline harm. And in places like Mexico and India, we can actually see online activity sparking real violence against women, sometimes even femicide. So we're really passionate about making that link and hopefully pushing for change to protect not just women, but other minorities and everyone's speech until we can all say what we want without fear of intimidation, harassment online, then really we don't have a free speech environment. And that's what's been so concerning about some of the developments we've seen, let's say with Elon Musk and Twitter. He claims to be for freedom of speech, but in reality, he's letting all of these really harmful pieces of rhetoric back on the platform, which is causing a lot of people to retreat. And I've spoken to young women in the course of focus groups that I've done who say, I don't want to have a public profile online because I don't want to deal with abuse. And what that means is they're not making their voices heard in the political system. They're not necessarily pursuing jobs, whether that's politics or any other public facing job. that might put them in that really unwanted spotlight. And I think that's a huge loss for democracies around the world.
That's right, and it's that's in the personal sphere, and it's very difficult to tackle that. I know in the UK we have libel laws that are different, that are more stringent. So the media has a certain, well, not, I mean, anyone who's seen British tabloids know there's not a huge amount of restraint there, but they do have some restraint there through fear of being sued for libel. But there's another side to this as well, isn't there? Which is malign state actors will use those same techniques that individuals might use to spread hate, but they will actually weaponize that in a coordinated attack. And I know Russia has a lot more things to worry about right now, and they have a lot more critics around the world than they did before, including most of the opposition who used to be in Russia, criticizing from within. Now they're scattered around Eastern Europe mostly. But one of the first people I interviewed was Jessica Aro, and the Russian GRU clearly had instigated a set of assets abroad and in her own country, Finland, who created what looked to be like a personal campaign of hate and abuse. But again, that's an extraordinary pressure on someone's mental health, and to deal with each physical case of the lies, the rubbish. It could be, photoshopped images that are not used, or pornographic images. It could be all sorts of allegations relating to your personal life, which then fed to the press. And you have to just counter them one by one, and to know that a government is behind it, and yet all the people around you, even your colleagues in the media, don't yet understand how malicious and malign the behavior of that government is. I know that's, this is a different world now, and no one will be surprised at Russia's behavior, but that shows the full extent of how dangerous, unfettered online sphere is when used by governments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did some research at the Wilson Center that looked at how Russia, China, and Iran have used what we call gendered disinformation against targets in the United States and beyond. And Jessica was an early example of that. I've also interviewed women in Ukraine, Svetlana Zalishchuk, who is a former member of parliament. She had some of that photoshopped kind of pornography shared about her that got so much traction. In fact, she was asked about it when she was visiting the United Nations by a German journalist. They asked if it was real. Similar things have happened in the Republic of Georgia, fake sex tapes released of women who are part of the political opposition there. And then we have, the very easy for Russia to amplify sorts of things where anytime there's a misogynistic narrative, all they have to do is kind of feed into that misogyny, and they know that it'll find fodder in the West, which I think is something that's really scary. And, you say people are a little bit wiser now. I think they are to some extent. But when I make the argument that gendered disinformation and online hate is a national security issue, people bristle. They say, oh, no, it's just a women's issue. But the point is, as you've very well laid out, Jonathan, that whenever we have these vulnerabilities, these social vulnerabilities in our society, bad actors, be they Russia, China, Iran, or others, can very easily seize on and amplify those vulnerabilities to the detriment of our democracy and to the detriment of our national security.
And race issues, gender issues.
Absolutely.
These are just another fault line, aren't they?
Yes.
Or nationalist issues where you have, say, Scottish independence, where you have the independence movement in Spain, you have the Yellow Jackets in France. Propaganda doesn't create these issues. And I think this is one of the problems. When we're criticizing disinformation, people can get very upset because it's as if you're saying that these issues don't exist, of, say, poverty, exclusion, etc. The pressure on the working class in America, the decline of traditional industrial jobs and so on. What propaganda does is feed on these real world issues because mainstream politicians aren't necessarily offering solutions. So it's a fertile ground, isn't it, for malign actors?
Yeah, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. I think a lot of people do bristle when you say, XYZ is disinformation, whether it's something like critical race theory or, issues related to gay rights. And yet, when you look at Russian disinformation sites, what be they, RT, Sputnik, or anything else, those are the exact same issues that they are using to target vulnerable populations in the target audience. So I think we just have to be very clear-eyed about that and understand, you can have those opinions, you can feel that way, but just understand that you might be targeted with information that is less than trustworthy, less than transparent in the searches that you're doing online and the content that you're consuming online as well.
What are the other challenges? And I know your work and the tools you produce aren't just sort of one-off. Something like the sort of Russia war map is something people can interact with every day. They can look at it and it gives them meaningful updates. And I think that's very powerful because it creates a worldview. It creates a tool that then becomes part of the way you consume information daily and not just as a sort of one-off hit. Because I think it's easy for people to accept that, yes, this was a lie, but then move on and be tricked by the next lie and the next one and the next one. Because I think that's one of the tricky things, isn't it? Is that Russian weaponized information, it creates a world, doesn't it? It creates, not always consistent, because much of that propaganda is contradictory, but it seeks to create an alternative reality in its entirety to suck you in, a little bit like the sort of Adam Curtis type documentary stuff. Whereas fact-checking, stop fake, all these kind of things which are kind of essential, they're much more sort of laser-focused and short-term, and they don't offer a holistic narrative or solution.
Yeah, I think you could say that it creates a world and the other ones are laser focused. You could also say one is proactive and the other is reactive. And I think we have to be really careful in not just trying to debunk every single lie that comes out of the Russian government. I mean, we're already way behind on that, and it would take forever. It would take everyone's waking hours and then some. And instead, what we have to offer, again, is that story that is compelling to people, whether it's the effect of disinformation on an individual person, whether it's the effect of the Russian, aggression in Ukraine on individual citizens and the suffering that Ukrainians are enduring in order to preserve their own freedom and work toward democracy. I think all of that is a lot more compelling. And we've seen that really meet success with the Zelensky administration too. I think I've said over and over since the beginning of this full-scale invasion that the Zelensky administration is really winning this information war. When you look at what Putin did and said in the early days of the conflict, slovenly, leaning back in his chair with his tie askew, talking for a very long time about really obtuse, obscure things, compared with Zelensky's very direct appeals to the West, to his citizens, compelling, authentic communication that was very human. I mean, who doesn't remember him going out onto the streets in the dead of night in Kiev saying, "Here I am in Kiev, I haven't run away," contrary to what the Russians are saying. All of that has proven so compelling and authentic, and I think has really appealed to people. And again, that's about storytelling and speaks to Zelensky's background as an entertainer, in my opinion.
And on that theme, I'm going to throw a little bone out there to the canine community on Twitter. NAFO, which not everyone in the audience will have heard of, but I know you'll have seen all of that. This is an extremely compelling way of countering propaganda, not by tackling the issues and pointing out whether they're sort of factually correct or not, but by coming back with memes and humor and a self-organizing, random, chaotic group, which nonetheless forms a kind of community with one purpose, which is to jump on and ridicule propaganda whenever it rears its head. What has been your view about the rise of that and its role in this whole counter-disinformation ecosystem?
Yeah, so the North Atlantic Fellas Organization, as they are called. You might know them on Twitter if you've seen little Shiba Inu dogs with various little outfits on them. These are folks who have made a donation in support of Ukraine. They then get that avatar sent to them by the NAFO folks. And they all, as you said, really respond to rapid response, different disinformation and propaganda coming out of Russian outlets or Russian aligned outlets. And I think there's a couple of things that it does that are really successful. One, it's a grassroots movement, so it doesn't have anything to do with the Ukrainian government or anything like that. The U.S. government, they're
really not based in Langley, right? They're just going to
I mean, as far as I know, so it's all over the world. I've got friends who have joined up, and I think it's compelling, it's funny, it's authentic, it is human. And it gives people a sense of agency and a sense of community and belonging in fighting against this kind of amorphous, big Russian propaganda machine. We've seen some other, really compelling, authentic grassroots movements coming out of different diaspora organizations as well. St. Javelin was started by a friend of mine, Christian Boris, who is a former journalist. He's a Ukrainian Canadian, and he started raising money for the war effort early on in the conflict, I think before even the full-scale invasion actually began, and has raised over $1 million now, selling funny t-shirts with memes on them, some really compelling t-shirts as well, stickers, other merch, and all of that now is being made in Ukraine, so supporting Ukrainian economy as well. And we've also seen just Ukrainians themselves reacting in such a resilient way to the invasion. I think the grind day after day of needing to go to the bomb shelter, needing to, get a generator for their home, needing to cook their dinner over a Bunsen burner. They've tried to temper that with humor. So whether that is memes about the grandmother who took down a Russian drone with a jar of tomatoes that was sitting on her balcony, or the memes about Ukrainian farmers pulling away Russian tanks that had been busted up with their tractors. Since the very beginning of the conflict, that's how they've responded, and all of that again I think is super compelling and human. There's something about a disinformation campaign that, when it's being organized from the top down in support of a government, it just won't ring true or as true with people than these very, authentic posts that are coming from real people who are in the thick of it. And that's what I think all of those efforts have in common. And it's not something that any government can really control or put out there. It's not like I'm going to, suggest that the US government engage in any of that. I think we'd be terrible at it. But what we can do is engender an environment where all of that happens, and that's what Zelensky did.
And let's flip that around then. Let's look at the top-down approach, because there's this, I won't call it a meme, but there's a phrase on Russian propagandist TV, which is, "Where have you been for the last 8 years?" As if to imply that, Ukraine has been attacking Russia for 8 years and not the reverse. But people seem to think that the genocidal hatred, a genocide inciting hatred, really only came about now. But that's not the case. It goes back at least to 2014, and almost certainly prior to that. I was speaking to some Ukrainians, saw evidence of that in the early 2000s in soap operas and their depiction of Ukrainians as slow-witted or criminal or peasants or servants or whatever, never in the more sort of thoughtful roles, never playing people who are sort of middle class, clever, whatever, academics or teachers or whatever. So clearly there has been a process of dehumanization that has gone on for many, many years. You then have 8 years of war and Russia becoming an ever more militaristic media sphere. And of course, this year you have extraordinary, weaponized propaganda. It's losing a little bit of traction maybe, and its audience figures are going down, but it's taken on board these sort of, I would call it the character of a death cult. It's become extremely macabre. And then you see that the so-called Generation Z, so children are being inculcated into militaristic ideas and even taught how to strip down rifles from kindergarten. So you're seeing this extraordinary use of information and hate to shape people's brains and thinking. First of all, I'll get your comment on that, but secondly, how do you reverse that? Because that's an extremely deep-rooted process, almost like sort of, cult brainwashing.
Yeah, seeing what has happened among the Russian population, and particularly over the past year, of course, it's been happening for much longer than that, but really just continued apace since February 24th. It's been extremely saddening to me, as somebody who spent time in Russia. And it's not all Russians, certainly, but I know Ukrainians are saying that that Russians need to risk more in order to hold their government to account, and it's hard not to agree with them given what they've suffered. And I'm not sure how we push back against it. I was earlier on this year a little bit more positive, but as we've seen these views become entrenched, as we've seen this Z campaign coming out of the Russian government and being supported throughout the country in such a full-throated way, it's been sad. It's been sad to see, and sad to see that, you know, even in the face of a mobilization, albeit not a full-scale mobilization, we haven't seen more outrage from the Russian people. We haven't seen more protest. And I think that just speaks to the fact that, you know, the media environment is so locked down in Russia. So many, as you mentioned before, of the opposition figures who influenced that conversation in the small sliver of opposition media that existed have now left Russia. They didn't have a lot of connection with the people in the regions to begin with, outside of big cities, you know, and so we're losing a grip on, if there ever was one, which I would argue there was not, on Russian society and kind of the mood of the Russian people. And that's going to be a huge problem in the future, no matter which way this war goes. And I'm not sure that there's anything that any government can really do to push back on that, given the situation with state-sponsored media, with the lack of independent media, and the fact that if certain reporters, you know, report certain stories out, they often get their visas revoked and sent out of Russia. So it's a really difficult situation, and I don't have a good answer for it.
I think, you know, some of the historians that I have had on the channel point out that, you know, this process was mostly successful in Germany and Japan. You know, some imperialist ideas remained. And even if you're traveling in Germany in the 60s, which I wasn't because I wasn't alive then, but if you were, you would have met, you know, you might have met older generation people who would express some pretty unsavory kind of views still. But what it seemed to take in both those countries was complete occupation, a complete root and branch reform of politics and the media. And then on top of that, you know, a couple of generations passing before those ideas were good and buried where they should be.
Yeah.
Those conditions are unlikely to be met in Russia. You know, even if they lose the war, there's no circumstance under which, you know, I can imagine a Western force occupying Russia and restructuring its government. I mean, it's difficult enough to imagine a liberal opposition occupying Russia and trying to chip away at this weaponization of education and the media.
Yeah, and I think that's really scary. If you look at Sean Walker's book, The Long Hangover, this kind of romance with the past and with, in particular, Stalinist era ideologies in Russia didn't just start with the war. It's been going on for a really long time. And that indoctrination isn't just about Ukraine. It's, again, about the USSR, about these ideals in Russia that no longer exist, a great power that no longer exists. And it's quite clever, actually, the fact that this indoctrination is happening among young people, because it means that even once the mohair berets, as they're called, the old people who are, you know, voting in droves for Putin and for stability and for Putin's policies, once they're gone, there's going to be an entire new generation that's ready to carry that torch forward. And as you say, I don't think it will be easy to chip away at, and I don't think we're going to see, I mean, I tried not to get into the prediction business, but I don't think we're going to see any sort of huge upheaval in Russia anytime soon. If the war didn't do it, it's hard to imagine what could.
My last question turns us back to more sort of familiar territory and is very much based on your book, which I highly recommend people reading. And again, it's got a very worrying title, which suggests that we may be losing the information war. And that really is the focus of my last question is, you know, what's the state of play in the West? Are there big differences in, say, Europe, UK, and US? And what do we need to do in order to, I don't know if this concept of win the information war, because it's like it's a constant struggle, isn't it? We come to realize that for democracy, freedom, it's not something you just win and move on for. You have to constantly fight it, and Ukrainians remind us of that. But what, in your view, do we have to do now to make much more resilient institutions in the West?
Well, Jonathan, I'm a lot less optimistic than I used to be, which is saying something given the title of my book. So I do think that the Central and Eastern European countries have led the way for the West in terms of what works and what doesn't. And that's what my book lays out. they continue to be kind of at the cutting edge of a whole of society approach to countering disinformation. It's not just about regulation. It's not just about government responses. It's not just about media literacy, although they all do invest in media and information literacy building. And I think that's crucial. We've seen the rest of Western Europe kind of slowly come around to that idea. And certainly I think the UK has led the way in their response to a lot of these issues, the coordination across UK government, for instance, in response to the Skripal attack, in response to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I think has all been admirable. The US government is lagging behind, and this can be said, regardless, for some Western European countries, but they do not have the degree of polarization that we're facing in the United States. The polarization and kind of toxification, not just of the disinformation issue, but of political discourse writ large. And that leaves us extremely vulnerable to outside manipulation from foreign powers. And it renders us completely impotent in terms of pushing solutions forward, whether those are legislative solutions or solutions that are suggested by a president and his or her administration. We have seen since 2016 the introduction of many bills about countering disinformation in the congressional space. Some simple ones, like, for instance, the Honest Ads Act, which Amy Klobuchar and the late John McCain introduced, and now it's sponsored, or at least it was in the last Congress, by Amy Klobuchar and Lindsey Graham. So it's a bipartisan effort. Has not gotten a vote ever in the Senate. All it would do is label who an ad was paid for by on social media. The same sort of thing that we have on TV, on radio, and in print. It would require that of social media ads, and that has not been able to get a vote. So that shows you kind of the polarization on the congressional side. And then just briefly, I also experienced some of that polarization in my last job. So I was selected to lead a body called the Disinformation Governance Board within the Department of Homeland Security. This entity, despite its dystopian sounding name, which I did not choose, was meant to coordinate activity across the DHS, which is a really large government agency dealing with many, many different portfolios. All we were doing was coordinate that activity relating to disinformation, bringing to bear best practices, kind of trying to put some brackets on something that can be pretty amorphous, and make sure that when DHS was doing this stuff, it was respecting American civil rights, civil liberties, and privacy, and of course, freedom of speech. Instead, that effort got totally blown out of proportion by partisans. And that's when I was dealing with a lot of threats against me and my family as well. I ended up resigning my role because the government didn't seem to want to stand by that effort. It was just too politically sensitive for them. And I thought that I could do much more impactful work outside of government. But it just shows the politicization of this issue and our inability to even do something really anodyne and boring, like a best practices working group. We're not even able to make that work in the current situation that we're in. So the US is not doing so well. The UK, I think, is doing pretty well. And Europe, I think, because of a long string of activity over the past 8 or 9 years in Europe relating to Russian malign campaigns, has sort of woken up to the threat of disinformation and related influence activities. So that's my short grading system. I'd give the US a D, the UK a B, maybe B plus, and the EU somewhere like C plus to solid B.
The Ukrainians are getting an A minus, are they? All right.
Yes, I think they're doing very well.
And that at least points the way to the future. And this is what the whole channel has been set up, is to say that there are people doing things that are working and that we should learn from them, and we should replicate what's working and continuously study that. In that respect, I think the work you're doing is incredible. I advise people to look at your website. We'll put links to some of your reports on the website in the description. Of course, we'll put the name of your book in there as well, so they can look that up at popular booksellers. I highly recommend as essential reading. I think people should really get up to speed with the digital war that is taking place, and until recently, unnoticed by most. And I want to give you a huge thank you for spending so much time for explaining this in such a compelling way.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Jonathan. Thank you for having me, and best of luck. It's a great effort that you've got going on.